Hi, everyone. My name's Natalie Curtis. I'm the senior producer for cultural events at the Toronto Public Library. That's Johanna Schneller, our host tonight, who's in the middle waiting to reconnect with us. We like to start all of our events here by acknowledging that the City of Toronto, including all 100 library branches, are situated on Indigenous land and dish with one spoon territory. There she is. This is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Toronto Public Library gratefully acknowledges these Indigenous nations for their guardianship of this land. I'm going to be brief because I want to get you all over to the conversation that you actually clicked here to see. I just want to tell you a couple of things before we start. For those of you who haven't used Crowdcast, you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, if you're on a desktop, that there's a chat function. A lot of you are already using it. That's terrific. This is where you should chat with each other, tell each other what branch your local branch is or where you're from if you're not logging in from Toronto tonight. If you have questions for Johanna and Emma, you should put them in the Ask a Question box, which you'll see just to the left of the chat function. If you want to know what people are asking, then click there and you can vote for the question that you like answered the most, and we can prioritize them in that way. Next, and most importantly, right below where you see our faces, there's a big green button that says click here to buy Pull of the Stars. That link is going to take you to our very good friends at Queen Books. Queen is one of our favorite indies in Toronto. Indie bookstores, all retailers, but of course indie bookstores need our love a little bit right now. There's no better way to support them than by clicking that button and buying Emma's book. Of course, if you're not in Toronto, you can buy Emma's book from wherever it is that you normally buy books, and we encourage you to do just that. And finally, if you want to know what other virtual events we have coming up here at Toronto Public Library, click that little TPL culture icon in the top right corner of your screen and hit follow, and you will see what we have coming up in the next little while. We have some great stuff. Aminato Sao and Anne Friedman are in conversation with Nanaba Duncan this Friday. The fabulous former broadcaster Marcy Ian is going to be talking about her memoir and a couple of weeks off script. And you can watch some of our previous events too. We've done things with Salima Nawaz, Otessa Moshfegh, Ocean Vuong, some incredible conversations that we've had. Feel free to watch those back. And that's it for me. I'm going to turn you over to the people who you came here to see. Our wonderful host tonight is Johanna Schneller. She is one of North America's leading freelance journalists specializing in entertainment features. She has profiled some of the most important actors of our time: Julia Roberts, Johnny Depp, Diane Keaton, Brad Pitt, Jeff Bridges. The list goes on and on. It's pretty impressive. Her cover stories have appeared in outlets like Vanity Fair, InStyle, Premier, Ladies' Home Journal. She was the senior writer at GQ, currently at the Globe and Mail, and she's been nominated for 4 National Newspaper Awards. She's also a screenwriter, an author, a broadcaster. I really could go on about Johanna, which is why we love her so much at TPL and why we're lucky to have her here tonight. And she is chatting with Emma Donoghue, who is an Irish emigrant twice over, says her bio. She spent 8 years in Cambridge before moving to London, Ontario. She's best known for her novels, which range from the historical, The Wonder, Slammerkin, Life Mask, The Sealed Letter, to the contemporary, Akin, Stir Fry, Hood, Landing. Her international bestseller, Room, was a New York Times Best Book of 2010 and was a finalist for the Man Booker, the Commonwealth Prize, and Orange Prize. Her screen adaptation, directed by Lenny Abramson, was nominated for 4 Academy Awards. She's also written drama for the stage and the radio. She is a favorite of mine. She's a favorite of the Toronto Public Libraries. I know she's a favorite of yours because there are so many of you here. And this book is not just timely and gripping, which is everything you want out of an Emma Donoghue novel, but it's also very hopeful. It's hopeful amidst the background of a pandemic, which is a little bit of what we all need right now. We're so excited to have both of you here tonight. I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being here. I hope everybody enjoys.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. And hey, Emma, it's so nice to see you, even in our little small square here. This is the part where I would normally say to the audience, This is the part where I would normally say to the audience, hey, raise your hands if you've read The Pull of the Stars, but obviously we can't do that here, unfortunately. So I was hoping that you could just give us a very brief sort of summary for those who haven't been able to read it yet.
Sure, sure. And, by the way, there are a few advantages to online events. I was just thinking that upvoting a popular question is a great one. Would that when we have in-person events, would that everyone could somehow tell who's about to ask a really bad, long question and, vote that down. We need some kind of telepathic link going for that. And The Pull of the Stars is, although it has come out in the middle of COVID, it was in fact inspired in 2018 by the centenary of the Great Flu of 1918. I call it the Great Flu because Spanish flu was just a racist propaganda touch of its day. It was like phrases that have not caught on, like Wuhan virus, The Spaniards were neutral in the war, so they were perfectly happy to admit that they were being devastated by the flu, and the countries that were fighting the war could not admit that they had it, so they all called it the Spanish flu, but I would just call it the flu pandemic of 1918. So I wrote the novel in 2018, 2019, sold it, did my final rewrites, delivered it on the 3rd of March, and then I was like, whoa, COVID. And my publishers said, instead of it being published next year, let's bring it out this year, because there's a conversation going on about pandemics. And I was startled by this, but I've really enjoyed the chance to have really substantial discussions about big issues. Fiction is often seen as just a little culturally decorative, so it's great to have a context for a novel like this in which all the big meaty discussions are on the table, So yeah, The Pull of the Stars is, I could have said it anywhere, but I went from my hometown of Dublin. I decided that I was most interested in a little fact I came across quite early on, that the people most vulnerable to catching this terrible strain of the flu, which killed between 4 and 6% of the entire world. So the people most vulnerable to catching it were women in late pregnancy or just after birth. So I thought, okay, where do they put them? I never heard that before. And I decided that a little maternity ward would be a great location for a novel like this, because I never read something set somewhere like that. So I thought, okay, we'll have one nurse in charge of the ward. And then, when I was researching how she would literally, change bedclothes and so on, I thought, okay, she has to have a second pair of hands. So I decided to give her one volunteer helper. And then I thought I'll have one main doctor. So you have 3 women over 3 days in a Dublin hospital in a tiny little makeshift maternity fever ward. That basically is The Pull of the Stars.
Wow. And the women who come and go for various reasons. And I love that it's not even a proper maternity ward, right? It's like a supply closet that they've repurposed for this, giving a good sense of how important pregnant women were. But since you mentioned that you finished it just before COVID and then the pandemic strikes, were you able to go back and change anything? Would you, if you could have? Was there anything that echoed?
I wouldn't have added anything that wasn't from 1918. The only thing I remember changing, Johanna, is that during the writing of the book, obviously I knew the pandemic was the correct term for this awful strain of flu that got everywhere in the world pretty much. But I thought pandemic sounded too jargony and sciencey and specialist a term. My sense was that they would mostly have just said epidemic or outbreak in 1918. So I used epidemic. But by the time I was doing my copy editing in April this year, pandemic had become an absolutely normal word that was on everybody's lips. So I thought, fine, I'll call it pandemic. I don't remember changing anything else because I really didn't need to. Already the echoes were so striking, and not just at this sort of shallow level of, people, dabbing eucalyptus oil on themselves, hoping that this would keep the germs at bay, or, wacky theories or mask wearing, but at the deeper cultural level of the fact that the pandemic, like any pandemic, it exposed the fault lines that were already there. So in my hospital, in my novel, it's a Dublin hospital serving the Dublin slums and with very poor patients mostly. And of course, they are like weakened by poverty, and in the case of the women, by having way too many babies and malnutrition and bad air and bad water, long before they ever happen to catch the flu. So just as we've seen this year with COVID, it's not random who dies in these pandemics. A pandemic just sort of exposes the the underlying shape of a society, and it exposes all the choices we've made about whose health should be well supported financially by our taxes to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, your writing is so strong here when you talk about how women have always fought and died in childbirth like soldiers, and you discuss, there's a saying that, or she has observed that every woman gives a couple of teeth for every pregnancy, that their limbs are shrunken, that you can see their veins. Your writing is very vivid, and I would say, is it fair to say maybe even a little bit angry here, because these things are overlooked, they're ignored, they're dismissed. Was that part of what you wanted to get across? There's a real urgency in your descriptions of what pregnancy does to women.
Sure. I mean, I've only had 2 myself, but my mother had 9 pregnancies and 8 children. And, she used to say to me, like, oh, I made sure to have enough milk and cheese because, a baby would just leach the calcium out of your bones. So I was really aware that, women like my mother, but poorer, having maybe 12 or 15 pregnancies instead of 8 or 9, it could absolutely wreck them. That in a way, the Irish cult of motherhood was a pre-existing condition, and poverty was a pre-existing condition, and the bad water, the tainted milk. The Dublin slums were the worst in Europe, and so it was very interesting that just by choosing to focus on mostly poor hospital patients, the novel became much more political than I planned. Because their bodies kind of speak very eloquently of the fact that it was in no sense a level playing field when this virus came along. It's anyone could catch it, but it would be those who are already weakened by poverty who would tend to die of it.
Yes, your nurse midwife lead character, Julia, at one point sort of shakes her head at the common phrase, if you love him, give him 12, that you're supposed to have 12 babies. And when she's writing her mortality reports, she wishes that she could put poverty as a cause of death, but of course she can't. She can only list the other symptoms. When do you know that you have found your lead character? When did you know that Julia was going to be it? And how do you sort of add that and the things that make her her?
Sure. Well, it's not so much that I have 6 characters in mind and I'm thinking who will be the lead. It's more like I knew I wanted to write about the pandemic just because at the particular moment it came in the 20th century, it was already a very modern society. There were trams and phones and telegraphs and electricity, and it was a high-speed world in which lots of people lived in cities. So the idea that this pandemic would have suddenly shut things down and made them all terrified of each other, I thought it would create an almost post-apocalyptic atmosphere. So once I decided to set it in a maternity ward, I thought, okay, that's small enough that one person could be in charge of it. So I thought a nurse midwife, perfect, because she will, be right there seeing the suffering of these women and trying to help them. And she'll have training, but she won't have that much authority. Nurses are an interesting job. I've written 2 novels about nurses now and 2 novels about sex workers, because these are both the classic women's jobs. And, a nurse both has a lot of expertise and training, and in 1918 really has very little authority. They weren't allowed to prescribe anything. The books telling nurses about the female reproductive system, they were written by doctors, and they say things like, the diagrams on the following pages, they're only so you'll understand when to run for the doctor. Don't be making any decisions. So I think they were far less respected than they are nowadays. So a nurse is in a very interesting kind of halfway up the ladder position. And all sorts of rules, such as, you were not meant to tell the patients your first name. You were meant to be very composed and ladylike and reserved. And there were a lot of protocols about how you would respectfully, obey doctors in every possible way, even doctors who knew nothing about gynecology, for instance. So I thought making my nurse midwife the protagonist would be a great kind of insight into what's going on, because she's kind of halfway, she's the boss of this tiny room, but she's got very little power within the institution as a whole. And then I thought, okay, she's going to need a helper. So I brought in Bridie Sweeney as her volunteer helper. And Bridie it's a gift to any novel if you could find somebody to come in as a complete ignorant outsider, because of course she gets to ask the basic questions and make the basic mistakes. And, she's like us blundering into this place and not knowing how to keep everything aseptic and, not knowing every little thing that she would need to about, say, delivery. So she's like the stranger who comes to town in a Western. You know, Bridie's ignorance was a great gift to me. And it made her a very strong contrast with Julia Power, who's so, you know, highly trained. And then, of course, I knew there would be doctors as well. And I thought, oh, if I can think of a woman doctor, that'll be quite an interesting, you know, we'll have these three women who are not mothers, all helping out this little cluster of women who are trying to give birth. And I was looking up background information about doctors in Ireland around then, and I found Kathleen Lynn. And I was not looking to bring a real historic character into this novel at all, because the pandemic seemed fact enough, you know. But Kathleen Lynn was so perfect in that she was not only a roaming doctor, she was never hired permanently by any one Irish hospital because the men didn't want a female colleague. So she had all these different specialties, including midwifery. But she was also involved in the 1916 rising against British rule, and she was the medical officer of Sinn Féin. So she was on the run from police during the month of my novel. So, you know, I couldn't keep her out of the novel. In the first draft, I tried just giving her a fictional name and keeping her politics slightly at bay. But my editors and agents were all like, tell us more about the revolutionary doctor. You know? So by the second draft, she had really moved into the limelight. Yeah. So really, it's a novel about three different women at three places on the kind of spectrum of power in the hospital.
Yes. And what I love about all of them is that they're all intelligent in their own way. Like none of the drama comes from them not being able to do their job or panicking or anything like that. Their drama is the drama of competence, which I really, really loved about that. You were going to read a bit for us.
Sure.
You said you had a section to read. Yeah.
By the way, I love what you said about the drama of competence. You know, I love all those TV shows in which everybody's very good at their job, but there's still all sorts of dramas. So, you know, everything from Grey's Anatomy to 24, you know, that kind of atmosphere of highly fraught competence. So I'm going to read you a little bit where a new patient, a very young woman called Mrs. O'Rahilly, is brought into the hospital in labour. Here we go. Mary O'Rahilly was clutching her bump through the nightdress, poking one finger into her navel. I asked, is that where it hurts? She shook her head. She caught a cough with the back of her hand. Just wondering how I know when it's about to open, she said. I stared. Your belly button? Mary O'Rahilly's voice trembled as she paced the room. Does it do it on its own, she said, or will the doctor have to force it? I was embarrassed for her. Mrs. O'Rahilly, you know that's not where the baby comes out. The girl blinked at me. Think of where it got started. I waited and then I whispered, below. The information shook her. She opened her mouth wide, then clamped it shut and coughed again, her eyes shiny. Bridie was standing on Mary O'Rahilly's other side now, holding open Gellett's midwifery, which she hadn't asked if she could take down from the shelf. Here, look, Mrs. O'Rahilly, you can see the top of the baby's head in the picture, look. And in the next, she flipped the page. It's sticking right out of her. Mary O'Rahilly flinched at the graphic images, but she nodded, absorbing the lesson. Then she walked away again as if she couldn't bear to see any more. Thanks, Bridie, I said, and I made a little gesture for her to put the book back before she or any of the women noticed the more disturbing sections, malpresentations, anomalies, obstetrical surgeries. Young Mary O'Rahilly was stumbling back and forward around the bed now, blinded by fright. Puritans who thought ignorance was the shield of purity, they made me so angry. I said to her, your mother should really have explained, Mrs. O'Rahilly. Didn't she bring you into the world this way? I've seen it happen dozens, no, hundreds of times, I said, and it's a beautiful sight. Trying all the time not to think of all the ways it could go wrong. I'll leave that there, thanks.
All the ways it could go wrong, dun, dun, dun.
You know, that bit there was inspired. I read an oral history of the Dublin slums, and there was a woman mentioned as in the 1950s, not knowing where the baby was going to come out, thinking maybe it was the belly button. And I thought, okay, if that happened in the 1950s, then I'm sure in 1918 there was more than one of them thinking,
wow,
where's it going to come out?
Oh my, it's so. Now you're very highly skilled in this book at capturing the drama of that confined space. And here we all are in our little squares watching this together. What is it? What appeals to you about that? Why do you like that sort of rigor of having them be all sort of confined, and then you can choose your moments when they get to break out and how to weight those moments? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, obviously, I have a thing for rooms. I must admit, and it's partly just it's a literary preference. I literally find it easier to make characters relate in an intense way to each other if I keep them together. You know, they don't have to be actually locked in there, but if they're kind of cheek by jowl, you know, then human relationships develop in a very intense way. You know, dislikes or alliances can happen very fast. And I thought in this case, in particular, there'd be a kind of intense bonding, much like the male soldiers in the trenches. You know, a situation of horrible confinement and terror all around, but you would bond so quickly with the comrades who with whom you'd go through a time like that. So I thought it would both make things very intense and stressful, but also it would really allow the friendships to ripen. And I think one reason that I've often written about situations of confinement is that I'm very interested in women's history. And let's face it, most women's lives have been too small rather than too big. You know, if you think of girls kept at home when the Taliban shut their schools, you know, women not allowed in public spaces. I've been in little Greek villages where it looks like all the women are dead, but it's just that they're at home and the men are outside in the cafes, you know. So I think writing about situations of confinement, I mean, childbirth literally used to be called confinement. I think that's a way of capturing the kind of flavor of women's history in particular, like all these highly able and intellectually energetic women, but working on a very small canvas.
Yeah, sorry about that. I have a little tickle here. But I hear you in every way. Those villages where you think, are there women here? I've walked through a few of those.
Yeah, Stepford. It's like, where have all the wives been put?
There are many scenes in this book that are highly emotional. Do you cry when you write?
You see, I'm going to sound hard-hearted about this, but no. I could easily be moved when I'm reading, when I'm doing my research. You know, if I read about something sad, I'm moved then. But when I'm writing a scene, I'm in my professional mode. And so if the scene is successfully going to upset my readers, I'm there going, yes. You know, the days I feel like crying are where I don't write a good scene. You know, material being sad can be extremely satisfying to me if it's the right kind of sad. You know, if I think of the right words and arrange them in the right order. So no, I find it deeply satisfying. You know, there are exceptions. There's the odd time I might have shed a tear, but mostly it's deeply satisfying, especially if I'm taking terribly dark material, but if I'm arranging it with a kind of, you know, I don't know, the right pattern, so it will feel aesthetically satisfying to the reader, even if terrible and sad things happen. I suppose it's taking all the random mess of life and it's putting a shape on it, you know. I mean, in real life, you know, if someone you love is in a sick ward, there's nothing beautifully shaped or pleasing about that at all. But the difference is that novels kind of create a more shaped and meaningful narrative in which, like, every little thing comes together. And somehow, I mean, I don't mean to completely aestheticize the experience. There's still misery and there's still mess. But I think novels can have a hugely consoling effect because they take all the kind of, you know, fears and miseries of our lives and they shape them. They make a pattern of it, you know?
Yes, yes, yes. I remember Paul Muldoon once said that things tend to stop rather than end. And I thought that was a beautiful way of putting it, that you don't really get that shape in life, much as we would wish that we could. Do you cry when you finish? Are you relieved and happy when you're finished?
No, I'm just very happy, but I'm always on to the next thing. You see, my projects overlap, so I'm never without something to be writing. So usually I finish, like, you know, maybe have a nice dessert at lunchtime and then straight on to the next draft of the next thing, you know.
So is that just something that you developed early in your career to make sure you always had something to go to, or is that the way your mind works?
It's more, I just can't say no, you know. I mean, I've made rules for myself, like, don't take on any more of that particular genre, you know. For instance, since Room, I've had 6 different film or TV projects that I've been involved in. And, you know, none of them have yet made it to the screen. So I've started to say to myself, Emma, stop taking on more screen projects. You know, but now say there's film interest in The Pull of the Stars, so I'm hardly going to say no to that, am I? I'm just a child in the sweet shop, you know, pointing at too many different candies, you know.
So Room was the first screenplay that you actually wrote. Is that correct?
I had drafted a couple of things before, but it's the first thing that got made. Yeah, it's the first time I sort of took it seriously. Yeah, and I had such a splendid time working with Lenny Abrahamson in particular that I really got the bug. I really enjoy it as a form of writing. Yeah.
Now, do I remember this correctly? You sort of wrote it around your kitchen table with him. He would sort of come over and you would.
I drafted it without asking anyone, but it's true that when we were working on it together, doing rewrites, he came and stayed here in London, Ontario for a couple of days, and we just sat at the table. Yeah, and he was so good at freeing me from too much obedience to the rules, because whenever you're a newbie or a convert, you're thinking, oh, I have to play it by the rules, and he's so steeped in film. He'd say, no, we don't have to do that. Forget about that rule, don't worry about where the climax comes, So
wow.
Yeah, he was a superb sort of mentor, and he's a real pal. It's been great to see his career flourish so much. During lockdown, it seemed as if everybody was watching his Normal People, his adaptation of Sally Rooney's novel.
It was absolutely lovely, wasn't it? So did this learning the sort of different language, the screenplay language with Lenny, did that influence the way you've written your novels afterwards?
No. I would never have wanted my fiction to be kind of, as it were, stained with film or vice versa. They're really different things. So when I was writing the screenplay to Room, for instance, I didn't open up the book at first. I thought of the story and how to tell it, with light and with faces. So similarly, when I'm writing a novel now, I try and really play to the strengths of fiction. A novel like The Pull of the Stars is so much in one person's head. It's like most of my books, it's an exercise in point of view in a rigorous way that you tend not to get in film. So, you're right inside Julia's head. And I deliberately this time, I didn't even use quotation marks because I wanted Julia to be so overworked and busy and have so many things pulling her attention that it has a slightly hallucinatory atmosphere in that, the songs she hears someone sing in the corridor and the cries of pain from the patient and her own thoughts and words and the dialogue she's having, they're all a bit of a crazy soup. So I would say films just do different things and have different strengths. So even when I've enjoyed adapting one of my works, like say with Room, I've been able to do a film and then also a play of it. But in each case, I feel I'm trying to kind of push to the extreme of what that particular literary form is best at, I think it would be really a shame to write something that's kind of, halfway. I hate when you're reading a popular novel and they stick in things like, he looked so like Tom Hanks. You might as well just say, ladies and gentlemen, I want Tom Hanks to be in the film.
That's hilarious. Although you could try one of those. You could just sort of cast your novel as you went along. I do wonder though, like there is something so cinematic about a lot of your descriptions of the various births and the sort of emergencies that take place inside this ward. You get very granular in your description of like her skin turned this color and I touched her this way and then I asked her to turn this way and then her feet were here and her head was here and so what was the thing that you were hoping to show us with that much detail? Like why did you as the writer get so specific in showing us what these people were going through?
Well, maybe I feel that just about everybody knows what it is to have a bit of a fever or have a cough, right? So if I'd been just writing about flu, I mightn't have had to get all that detailed about the symptoms because you could deduce most of them. But not everybody has experienced labor, right? Birth is a very peculiar thing and it's not a disease, but it's a phenomenon that it can be joyful and it can literally kill you. And it's wonderfully unpredictable. So it's a gift to a novelist because somebody can be having a really normal, healthy, happy birth, and then it can go horribly wrong even afterwards, like happy birth, and then the woman dies of sepsis. And equally, it can be 3 days grueling work, and then suddenly everything's fine. So I thought by focusing my novel on birth, it's not often done. And I thought in that case, I had to get highly specific because every birth is different. And, you can't know in advance. You might think, oh, yes, I've always given birth perfectly well before. Everything's fine. My mother gave birth fine. And then you can really hit an obstacle. So it's wonderfully unpredictable narratively. And I thought that being very detailed about these women and their birth experience was the way to go. I knew I would lose a few squeamish readers, but, you always lose a few readers. There's a moment early on when you feel you can imagine certain readers walking away and you're like, okay, lads, see you next time.
I was very into the strength and the physicality and the sort of like warriorness of it all. And the heroism of these midwives and doctors and nurses and what they're doing all the time. At one point, Dr. Lynn describes her ideal hospital that she would hope to found someday, and the hospital's run by women, and it respects women, and it understands women's anatomies, and in a way, she is sort of almost talking about a world run by women. Did you sort of let your fantasies run wild in that direction?
Well, the reason she's describing it this way is that she would go on to found that. It was a small hospital, but it was a small hospital for babies in particular, where the mothers would be sent off to have a holiday in the countryside. So she and the woman she lived with all her life, they managed to found that hospital, St. Ultan's, the following year. There's a sad moment when she basically reached out to the Catholic hierarchy of the country and said, like, more or less, will we found a big hospital for babies together? And they were like, oh no, we want a specifically Catholic hospital. We don't want some Protestant woman running it. So, sectarian divisions got in the way. But she ran this small hospital, and she hired women doctors, Protestant or Catholic, and lots of nurses, quite a few women who'd been in the revolutionary movement with her. And yes, it was remarkable because it was really the only place focused on the health of young children. But yeah, I found it she was so perfect for my purposes, Dr. Lynn, because she was she was a feminist first, and then got into the labor movement, and then through that decided that Ireland needed its independence. But it meant that her politics were really sort of rooted in a wish to make the world better. And again, given that she worked in midwifery, I think it made a lot of sense that just literally seeing what her patients went through would be what taught her politics. These weren't abstract ideals. It was very much like, these women need to have fewer babies and eat more food.
Yes. And you have a real anger in the way the Catholic Church treated unwed women, orphans. Is that something that you knew about and wanted to get more out into the open? Is that something you discovered in your research?
Yeah, no, I remember. It's funny, when I was growing up, most of us went to schools run by nuns, and hospitals run by nuns and so on. And we just sort of thought it was natural that charitable institutions would be run by monks or nuns, and that generally these were a good thing. And then I remember in the early 90s coming across a book that sort of exposed how horrible and abusive many of these institutions were, and the fact that Ireland has locked up really a huge percentage of its poor. In Canada, we tend to see this as a specifically kind of racist impulse, like the sending of Native people to residential schools. But in Ireland, this was all directed basically at the working classes. So, kids who weren't actually orphans, they were just maybe playing music on the street or begging on the street, would be sort of scooped up and sent off to an orphanage. Kids who got into any trouble at all would end up in a so-called industrial school. Girls who were either pregnant or considered to be at risk of getting pregnant would be sent off to a Magdalen laundry for, repentant girls. And in the mother and baby homes, if you had a baby there, you had to then stay on and work for either 1 year or two to sort of pay off the costs of your stay. So these were kind of forms of incarceration. So like many Irish people, I've been horrified to discover more and more about this aspect of our history. And Bridie, the volunteer in particular, is inspired by many details from the Irish government's big long report on these residential institutions. So it's the first time I've ever used a government report as a source for a character. Because I like the idea that that she's seen the worst side of these institutions, and yet she's able in the middle of a pandemic to find energy and intelligence and warmth in herself to offer these women.
Yeah. Now, you obviously did a ton of research for this, and you're researching, things that can happen to women's bodies, things that have, been inflicted upon the impoverished. Did you have sleepless nights? Did you have weird dreams while you were writing this?
No. I just remember having to work really hard at the medical stuff. I don't have a background in this at all. The last time I did any biology would have been about 15 or 16. So, I kept very detailed files on things like, okay, the patients with low blood pressure, what might be causing that? And there was always the complication of there's the pregnancy, but then there's the flu. and what could you do for it nowadays? I would try and get a completely accurate modern understanding of it from modern medical websites, and then I would say to myself, okay, which of these drugs or insights or machines did they have in 1918? Oh, almost none of them. So what might they do for it then? And even I remember even using some of my own confusions. So at one point I realized that to stop a woman from fainting at a particular moment of crisis, Julia should put the woman's legs above her head, but then to help her breathe, given that she's dying of the flu, you should put her chest up. So it was literally a moment of impossibility, like legs up, legs down. How can I save her life? Which crisis ranks highest right now? So yeah, the medical stuff was quite a stretch for me. And sometimes I was just bewildered by an attempt to understand all this material. And then, of course, write a paragraph in which it would all be nice and clear. I didn't want my readers to feel like, oh, I can't follow the medical details. So, trying to consolidate and cut through huge quantities of medical material and be true to both ears, be true to the facts now, but also respect the fact that their ways of doing things were very different in 1918. And there's so much they didn't know. They didn't know what a virus was, for instance. They couldn't tell what the flu was because they didn't have microscopes that would show you a microbe that small. So by comparison, we are well equipped to deal with COVID because, if we trust our scientists, they actually do know a huge amount about it. In 1918, they were blundering around.
Wow. Now, you've obviously written a lot of historical fiction, as Natalie mentioned. Do you always filter then through now? Do you make sure that you don't? Is there some, because obviously something that's of historical interest has to have a resonance in our day. So beyond the obvious of the pandemic, like what did you want to sort of resonate from then to now?
That's a good question because in a way, every historical novelist writes a different sort of contract with the reader. Like some of them are very postmodern and playful, and they'll let themselves throw in anachronisms because they figure, oh, it's all just a story. Whereas I want to take my readers on a trip, and I want my readers to trust me, more or less come with me to 1918. And so I'm not going to include a word that people wouldn't have said. I'm not going to give them any thoughts that they couldn't have had. But of course, I'm aware that I'm bringing my own interest with me. So for instance, many of us pick protagonists who are rather more feisty and rule-breaking than perhaps the average woman would have been in 1918. Because in a way, we're looking for a character to bridge that gap between 1918 and 2020. So, somebody who was just completely obedient and kowtowing to the nuns is just less likely to strike a spark with my readers than somebody like Julia. So, of course, you're bringing your own interests. Even if you're completely accurate about 1918, the very fact that you're choosing to focus on something like childbirth rather than, the peace treaties, it shows that you're bringing your own priorities. And a lot of us are kind of revisionist in our interest in basically the nobodies, the women, the slum dwellers, or even
the unrecorded,
and traumatized army veterans rather than, brave, decorated military leaders. We're all interested in the underdogs nowadays, so that's a very 21st century preoccupation.
Yeah, I do like hearing the stories of the unrecorded. I think it fills in history in a way that we absolutely need. But let's go back a little bit to your history, Emma. What kind of a kid were you?
I was just obsessively bookish, really. I mean, I toil up to the library every Saturday with not only actually, I have to explain that, you could only borrow a certain number of books on your card. It wasn't like now, nowadays there's so much trying to encourage kids to read that you can borrow unlimited numbers. But in those days, it was maybe 4. So I would have my library cards and then the library cards of my elder siblings who'd grown up and left. I was the youngest of 8. So I'd have this, sheaf of library cards, including cards that got you into the adult library. So then I would toil home with a giant sack full of books. And I read all the time. I wrote poetry from the age of 7. We weren't allowed much TV. It was sort of one program a night that the whole family had to agree on. So really just obsessive reading and writing and making up stories in my head. Yeah. And I did not have a very dramatic childhood at all. You don't have to have a hard childhood to be a writer. You can just write about other people's hard childhoods. You don't have to actually live it yourself.
Yeah. But I did read somewhere that you said you realized that you were a lesbian and a writer at about the same age, 14. And I wondered, did something specific happen
Well,
that
I fell in love with the girl. I suppose the thing was that I'd been writing poetry already, but now suddenly I was writing it in that really fraught way of, I must express my secret love, especially as I couldn't express it, in society. I had to keep it all secret. So yes, writing intense poems every day with gender neutral pronouns or addressed to you rather than she, that really got me through. And then, I'd go ahead and submit the poems for school competitions, figuring they'll never know who I'm talking about. So yeah, poetry really saved me. I was in this curious position that I was a sort of high achieving good girl who got good marks, but I thought if they knew I was gay, oh my God. I didn't know would they send me to the priest or the psychiatrist, and either seemed horrifying,
Yeah.
So yes,
yeah.
1980s Ireland was not a good place to realize that you were a lesbian. Yeah. But it sort drove me into the arms of poetry.
Well, so we're all the better for it. So I also read that you sought out books with lesbian protagonists, and that took you to some unusual places. There was a sort of early book that you found, as I recall.
Yeah, some really trashy books. I mean, I bought everything I could find, and yeah, there was one about a dropout nun in particular, I remember. But I suppose it made me briefly not care at all about genre or literary quality. So, I read a bit of everything. I have some very lurid sort of pulpy novels, yes. But it's hard to explain to modern readers how you would feel if there was no representation for you at all. And not just that you wanted representation, like, oh, there should be books about me, but more like have my type existed, or are we some kind of weird anomalous symptom of Western decadence, so reading, say, the poems of Emily Dickinson and realizing, okay, she was clearly in love with her sister-in-law, that was deeply strengthening to me, because it made me think, okay, we've always been around. I just have to survive my adolescence, and then somewhere out there in some other part of the world I will be free.
Yes. I mean, I think we read to experience how other people experience being alive, right? And if you never, ever, ever get the chance to see anybody who's even a fraction like you, yeah, then you feel like you're just so alone. Whereas books can really make you feel like you're together. So what were the first things that you wrote that you actually thought were any good? Do you remember? Or anything that really gave you pleasure beyond the poems?
Yeah, I found poetry really very satisfying from about 7 through to 19. And then I got an idea for my first novel at university. And that was published as Stir Fry. So yeah, I kind of sort of flipped over from poetry into fiction. And I was writing plays at the same time as well. I loved acting in my teens, but when I got to university, I realized that really I was in a bigger pond now, and others were much better at acting. So I thought I would write the play. So I began with a few adaptations and then moved into writing my own plays. So I've always found fiction and drama kind of equally satisfying. And even now I would find it painful to choose between them. I mean, maybe if I had to pick one, I'd go for fiction, because I get to choose all the words. It's my own little universe. But I absolutely love working with actors. I love drama in all its forms, whether stage or radio or screen. And I love the collaborations that you get now with either theatre or film or TV. I like that kind of jostling of minds, So yeah, I enjoy moving between all these genres, and I like trying out new things as well. Especially since Room, because it was such a hit, I thought it really important for me not to rest on my laurels. So I immediately tried writing for younger readers, which was scary in a whole new way. And now I'm trying to write a musical with a composer. So, I think it's very important to keep asking yourself to try new things to keep you in that sort of beginner mind, as the Buddhists would say.
Yeah, that's amazing. Was your ambition for yourself ever hard for you to admit to? Did you ever have to tussle with yourself over it? It sounds like you have a pretty healthy relationship with.
I think I was a very confident kid, and I was well raised. My parents are both very bookish and both took books very seriously. So they used to listen to every poem I wrote. I'd rush in and read it to them, and they never laughed and they never said no. And my mother always asked for a copy. So no, I think I was hugely confident, and it's not that I thought I could make a living as a writer. I thought I'd have to have a sensible job as well, but I always thought I was going to write, and that someday would be published.
Wow,
I'm very
that's
lucky.
amazing.
I've never had that deep down sense of fear about it, and also I've always so enjoyed the process. I like nothing better than a day writing. Yeah.
That's incredible. I wish I could say the same. Now, you mentioned Room, obviously, and the tremendous success it had, 2 million copies sold, and the screenplay, and the Academy Awards, and at one point in your life, you sort of joked, like, "Oh, I'll write a screenplay and it'll win Oscars," and blah. And when it actually happened, did it feel the way that you thought it would?
Well, your fantasies are always a little bit more, perfectly scripted than your reality, that year in which we were publicizing the Room film, and I say we because it's funny, when you're publicizing a novel, you're quite isolated, but publicizing a film, you're really in a kind of a team together, and that was fun, all the kind of joking around with the others as we were on the road. And, because it was mostly an Irish company who'd made Room, we did an awful lot of mutual mockery, It wasn't the kind of Hollywood style of mutual praise, there was a lot of taking the piss. But I remember, I enjoyed that year very much, but I also would get the giggles at times because it was so not the world I was used to. The book world is very down to earth and unglamorous by comparison. There may be glamorous moments or the odd pretty frock, but mostly it's, chatting to librarians over the apple juice and the cheese cubes, and mostly chatting about what's the latest book you love, So I found the film world very different, and even film film publicity often extraordinarily shallow and focused on what everybody was wearing. I wouldn't have minded if all the questions were about films, but they weren't even. Often the questions were just about publicity. The interview would say something like, "When did you first know there was going to be a lot of buzz about your project?"
Did you have one unbelievable posh moment, though? Did you have like one fabulous penthouse hotel room or one unbelievable dinner?
Not just one. Yeah, no, it felt like really a whole year of it, and yeah, Chris and I would go off to the BAFTAs or the Golden Globes or whatever, and we'd just be like, "Look at us, this is hilarious." And I do remember on the Oscar red carpet bumping into Colin Tobin, whose novel had been adapted as Brooklyn, and Nick Hornby, who had adapted it. And Nick and Colin and myself, none of us very glamorous, and all of us sort of writers in midlife. We were like, "How did we end up here?" And we did feel like total imposters at that point. But imposters who were having a good time.
Oh, yeah. Imposters who deserved it completely. So before I move on to the audience questions, I want to ask you just a couple more. Can you tell us what you're working on? Like, you mentioned a few things on the go. What are you able to talk about?
Like many writers, I'm a bit distracted this year. So instead of just working on one thing, I would say I have a very early medieval novel on the go, I have a contemporary novel on the go, and I have a musical. And that's all I can tell you. Who knows which of them will come to fruition first.
And you mentioned television or film projects. Can you give us a hint about those?
Well, I'd say the one most likely to be filmed next is an adaptation of my novel, The Wonder, from 2016. I'm doing that with Element, the same company who made Room, but a different director. And I've really enjoyed working with them again. And because the novel is set in 19th century Ireland, I think they will do a really beautiful job of it, and will save it from any of those kind of cliched representations of the Irish past.
Oh, wow.
But of course, COVID has cast such a shadow over both film and even more so theatre production. So there are many uncertainties. But yeah, I think probably the next film project will be The Wonder.
Okay. All right. Well, we will definitely look for that. And I know this is kind of a big question, and we've addressed it a little bit, but can you put into words why you write? Like, what do you think is the need in you, or the pleasure that you get out of it?
I think even if none of it was going to be published, I think I would do it because it's like kids who enjoy playing with Lego. I get an actual gratification from putting the bits together, even before anybody else has read it, and irrespective of whether it's going to bring me any fame or glory or money. I just enjoy it at the technical level, putting a few words together that have never been put together before. I like the way it lets you cultivate your own obsessive interests and follow your own, lines of curiosity. I like the fact that you can make stuff up. You can put words together and you make a person who doesn't really exist, and then your readers believe in that person, and they will even argue with you about that person. They will write to you and say he wouldn't have done that. I think the trick worked. This is amazing. I've made a person out of nothing.
Yes, a person that other people feel strongly about.
Yes, a figment of our collective imagination. Yeah.
Has our pandemic, our current pandemic, changed any of your thoughts about the importance of writing or the way we reach one another? I mean, we're all probably more alone than we usually are. Do you feel like that's colored you as a writer at all?
It has given me a very vivid longing for the pleasures of collectivity. When I'm watching films now that were filmed before COVID, and people are all jostling against each other in restaurants and so on, I think, oh, how wonderful. I want that world back. Not every aspect of it, but I definitely want the crowdedness of it. Theatre I miss with a particular vividness because the stage production of Room, it was cancelled on its opening night in March here. And that was very, very hard. But of course, even as an audience goer too, I miss live performance. Yeah, so I think I will probably want to go to live performances even more as soon as they're allowed. But I'm glad that people have had books to resort to. I think books have been a huge lifeline for many people. And, it's important to be open-minded about how we do this thing called literature. So when, say, audiobooks came along or ebooks, I was always happy that there were just new stories, new ways of getting stories into people's heads and new ways for readers to respond. And so obviously, in-person events I found more fun. But events like this one can sometimes reach people who couldn't get to the in-person events or who didn't live in the right big cities. So in some ways, the COVID, shockwaves, they have, by making us all live a bit more on the internet, they have slightly reduced the divisiveness of geography. So, you can take part in things that aren't happening in your little bit of the world. So I've tried to look on the bright side about some of those things. But no, I miss travel, and I long to go back to Ireland and see more of my family again. And theatre. Yeah.
I miss hugging. I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions from the audience now, if that's okay.
Sure.
There are a lot of questions along sort of the same line, so I'm going to compress a couple of them, and they have to do with your research into the actual maternity wards and nursing homes at the time and the kind of medical care that was available at the time. So people have asked, how did you learn so much about maternity wards? What's the most interesting kind of thing you learned about the medical care?
Sure. I was quite shocked to realize that there was so much they didn't know back then. They knew about things like, how to kill germs and so on, but there was a huge amount they didn't know. I would look up some concept that I find totally routine now, like the immune system, because, it seems fairly obvious now that if pregnant women were responding so badly to flu, it must have been a sort of immune over response. So I look it up, and they don't have a concept of the immune system back then. They didn't have a concept of a virus. There was so much they didn't know. And the treatment of pregnant women in particular, I mean, really in the books by doctors about childbirth, the doctor will say, like, you will now deliver the baby, very disempowering to the woman, very much, not on her back, but flat on one side. I think in Germany, they had them on one side, in Britain, they had them on the other, so there was a kind of a national protocol for how to place the laboring woman. It was nothing to do with what she wanted, So most of what I researched made me very grateful for how it is today, by contrast. And another thing I found interesting was that I read a lot about the training of nurses, and only about half of what they were taught was in any sense medical. The rest was all like how to keep the hair neat, how to, fold the apron neatly. There was a huge amount about composure and punctuality and manner, and you being as sort of dignified as possible in order to reassure your patients that they were in safe hands, so different from nowadays. So I was really trying to capture the kind of mindset at the time and to figure out how thrilling it might have been for somebody like Julia to actually find herself, briefly in charge of a ward rather than, always kowtowing to her superiors, because hospitals were very, hierarchical. It was very much an army model of things. There was none of this, using your individual initiative. So within that very strict structure, to show a time of crisis, giving a nurse like Julia, in a way, an opportunity to take the initiative and run things herself. It was quite exciting to see her kind of break out of those, trammels.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Even though she did keep her apron neat the entire time. So what was your thinking behind keeping it to 3 days? It's just such a very tight time frame, and yet the whole world happens in that time frame.
I knew I wanted Julia to get to know 2 women she's never met before, so I couldn't do it all in one shift, but I wanted it to feel very, very intense, and to include several births, and I don't know, if it had been over, say, 10 days, there'd have been a lot of different patients coming in. But I thought 3 days would let me have a little kind of cluster of patients with a few faster births and one longer one, all within that time slot. And also, my Catholic upbringing really lingers. 3 days of Jesus descending into the underworld and coming back again. It's just one of those kind of mythic measurements of time, 3 days,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It is just enough time for your entire life to change, too. It is very well put. So one other question from the audience is, how do you let go of your characters? Now, you've lived with Julia and you've lived with Bridie, and they're so vivid. Do they live in your head for a while afterwards? Do you just
they do.
bid them farewell?
And I sort of wonder what they would think of things, and occasionally speculate about them. And of course, if I get to adapt one of my books into another form, it's like revisiting them. It's like old friends,
Mm-hmm.
But mostly it's the fact that I'm always working on something new. That's what helps me. If I had a period of blank or nothing to do after a book, I might find myself very nostalgic for the characters in it. But my attention is always sort of divided between, my different projects anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But it is quite nice that in publicizing a novel, you get to stay with it at least part-time for a while. You literally get to read bits aloud and think about it just a little. You get weaned off it, as it were, I suppose.
It's not a hard goodbye. And okay, last question here is there something that you're reading right now, something you discovered during the pandemic, a new author, a new book?
Oh, who shall I recommend? Two great novels about being 20-somethings, basically. Kylie Reid's Such a Fun Age, about a nanny, brilliant, and Luster by Raven Leilani. And I found both of those so good on the kind of, what it's like to be in your 20s, and both of them so smart about race and class and the sort of invidious distinctions between people, and very darkly funny as well, both of those. So Luster and Such a Fun Age.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And I've so enjoyed talking to you. And now we're back over to Natalie. Hi, Natalie.
Hi, thank you both so much. That was such an incredible conversation. Honestly, I was alarming at how fast the time was going by. But it was good timing, and those are good recommendations to end on, Emma. Thank you so much. And I will actually say this, even though it's not even on our website yet, but we do have an event right here on this channel with Kylie Reid on November 25th.
Herb. And
she's going to be fantastic. And it is a terrific recommendation. Of course, before we get there, you should all go out to read The Pull of the Stars. I'm going to remind you all actually to click that button that says click here to buy The Pull of the Stars. It will take you to our friends at Queen Books. Like I said, we're trying to give some love and some shout outs to our indie bookstores. So if you're not in Toronto, call around, find out who's open or who's doing curbside pickup or who's doing delivery. Lots of them are now. The best way to support them is to go out there and to buy your books from them, buy The Pull of the Stars from them. If that conversation didn't make you want to read that book, I do not know what will. Thank you both so much for being here tonight. I look forward to the day that we could recreate this pairing on stage in real life, when we can all go to the theater again and all come back to the library. Thank you all for tuning in tonight. Click that button. Thank you, Emma and Johanna, and I hope everybody stays safe out there. We'll see you again next time.